Hello everybody, this is Tip Top Gaming here today with another Magic the Gathering Arena news video. And today we are going to be talking about Historic and suspensions and bans and all that. So why don't we jump just right into this. So today the state of the game, which is basically their December update post, was released, and with it came along this post, and the last video was really long, so I decided to make this a separate one, especially because it kind of attracts a different audience. So why don't we jump right into this. This historic ranked period is around a month old, and we've been eagerly looking over the feedback and data we're gathering on the new format. We're generally happy with what we're seeing there, with good play rates and fairly healthy looking meta balance. Only a couple decks are more than 5% of the meta, and for the most part, win rates are showing a good, healthy spread. There are a couple outliers here, though. We will be addressing those in a second. We're happy with how the cards in Historic Anthology 1 have been adopted, where several have found key roles in decks, and the addition of some has allowed for new archetypes. We are seeing the new cards appear in over 20% of the decks used in high-level Historic play, which is a good sign. We've landed about where we wanted to be. Good, useful options, but not something that has warped the format around it. Burning Tree Emissary has proved the most popular new card, showing up in both Gruul and Jund shells. The Soul Sisters archetype has also proven popular, using Soul Warden and Sarah Ascendant to complete a mono-white life gain package. So basically they're saying, hey, Historic, this rollout has been pretty smooth in terms of the meta. Now, things like MTG Goldfish have not been tracking it because there's no Historic events. However, so it's kind of hard to see what are the meta decks. So if you guys want to tell me if you guys are playing Historic, what decks you're playing, let me know in the comment section down below. I'd love to see what's happening here. But basically they're just saying Burning Tree Emissary, which looks like that, and Sarah Ascendant and Soul Warden are being the most popular cards. Overall, playing Historic is tracking slightly lower than we'd like to see. Well, I think that's part of it, is that the only queue for it, besides like the play queue, which people don't even realize is Historic, so I think if you brand it as Historic, it would be better, but is best of 3. Overall play Historic is tracking slightly lower than we'd like to see, which is largely seems to be coming from players preferring to play okay, maybe I should read the next sentence. Best of 1 over best of 3. Somewhat surprisingly, we saw about 3 times the rate of games played in the Historic launch best of 1 event than we did in the Historic ranked queue best of 3. Well, when I play MTG Arena, I like to play it and then I don't want to spend an hour on one game. I know it's technically 3, but I prefer just playing those quick games, and I know that's not what Magic should be, as some people would say, but I think the format really works for Arena. This suggests that while best of 3 is the most competitive way to play, the majority of players still prefer a best of 1, and this holds even in the Historic format, which we expanded to attract more competitive-minded players. With this in mind, we're looking at expanding the importance of best of 1 play in future ranked Historic periods. So basically, what's important here is that, hey, we noticed that best of 1 does 20 times better than best of 3, so we're gonna start doing best of 1 ranked soon. Cards we are suspending in Historic. Getting back to those outliers in win rate and diversity, there are a few cards we've identified as being problematic in the Historic meta, and we'll be taking action to address those. None of the cards we're acting on here will come as a surprise. Once Upon a Time. We're seeing much the same thing in Historic that we saw in Standard and Pioneer. Once Upon a Time is very prevalent in any deck playing green, and it's leading to green in general being overrepresented in the meta. Suspending it, more on what suspending means below, should help bring greater deck diversity. Field of the Dead. Similar to Once Upon a Time, Field of the Dead is constraining Historic in much the same way it affected Pioneer. It's having too large of a dampening field on controlling and reactive deck options. Suspending this should allow for a wider variety of deck archetypes to be viable in Historic. Veil of Summer. Much as we saw in Standard and Pioneer, Veil of Summer's high efficiency is proving stifling to the overall metagame by neutralizing too many color counterplay options. Suspending this card should bring more diversity to the answers and decks performing well in Historic. Oko Thief of Crown. We wanted to give Oko a chance in Historic, but the data is showing similar, through less severe issues to what we saw in Standard. He's not nearly as prevalent as in the meta, only about 15% of decks, but several of these decks are seeing win rates that exceed 55% in high-level play. This suggests that the meta share could grow quickly, so we're suspending Oko now to prevent that. So basically, these cards are all banned in Standard, so they're basically just banning them in Historic, because you know what? Guess what Historic has? All the cards from Standard, plus more. So that means more problems, although that could mean more solutions. Generally, that just means more problems. However, these cards are being suspended, not banned, and we'll talk about that in a second. The historic card pool is somewhere between Standard and Pioneer, with a few quirks of its own. Over time, those differences will increase, but for now, it makes sense that the cards, having shown themselves to be problematic in those formats, would also be problematic in Historic. Unlike Standard and Pioneer, Historic is a digital format. That means we have the additional options for how we address these cards, like instead of banning them, using a new mechanism called suspension. Historic is evolving rapidly, both from... basically, they're just saying, hey, since this is a digital format, we can suspend things. And I talk a lot about that in the other video where I talk about why it's more acceptable for them to ban things right away, or to suspend instead of ban, or make, like, rules, like this card can't be used with this card, so on and so forth. And I talk about that in the State of the Game breakdown I posted earlier today. What suspension means. Historic is evolving rapidly, both from general play and because it's receiving new cards fairly regularly. To support it properly, we need a way to control the balance that works well with Magic's history of bans and restrictions, while allowing more flexibility to adjust as Historic changes. Suspending cards gives us the mechanism. For gameplay purposes, a suspension works like a ban, in that the card will not be legal to use it in format while it's suspended. But unlike how we handle banning cards, we plan to use the flexibility that the digital format provides to move cards onto and off the suspension list more commonly. The off of portion there is important. Suspension isn't a final verdict. It's an indication that we think that a card might be causing issues, and we'd like to see what the meta looks like first without that influence. So, in Standard, a lot of them are like, hey, we're banning this card, and hey, why didn't we ban anything else? Well, we're looking at these cards, but we want to see how the meta adjusts to these changes. Well, what they're saying here is basically they're not going to do that. They're going to be like, this card's a problem. It may not need to be banned, but it's a problem. Why don't we just take it out for like a month? Although on the other one, they do say until the end of the season. However, I assume what can happen is that they're going to... So basically how the standard procedure is going to work, right? Let's say Oko's banned now, right? When it gets to the end of this historic season, which will be, I believe, when Theros Beyond Death is released, what'll happen is though all of the cards on the list will be evaluated, and they will either be banned or unrestricted or unsuspended. So nothing will stay on the suspension list, is what I'm understanding. However, it also seems like they might be able to they're not going to limit themselves to 4 times a year, making those changes. So it sounds like any time they can just be like, well, you know what? The meta is reacting poorly to not having this card in it, so let's just throw it back into the pool. So I think that's really good. It allows them to be a little more risky, because instead of saying we're banning this, we're just suspending it, which, I mean, I think some people are going to be angry that, hey, I have to wait like a quarter of the year in order to get my wild cards for it, which we also don't know what the precedent is for wild cards in Historic. Now, I'd assume if it's like a card that is Historic Anthology, that you'll get wild cards for it, because you never were able to get that through Standard. However, I could see them either not awarding them for cards that were in Standard, or awarding like half a wild card, rounded up or down. I don't really know. So you could get 2 if you had 4, which I think is kind of lame. They keep valuing Historic cards at either more value or less or equal value to Standard cards, which in reality they aren't. They're used in half of the formats. Historic Brawl and Historic versus Standard cards can be used in Standard, Brawl, Historic Brawl, and Historic. So I think those cards should really be seen like as better. Like the Dominaria draft, I didn't really complain about this in the last video, but it still costs 5,000 coins, and I get that's because of the gems and things, and I'm not super bashing on this event. However, I think that the cards should be valued less because they can be used in less formats. Now, that's not exactly true. I mean, old beta cards are some of the most expensive cards in the game. That's because they don't see printing, but like in this situation, I think it's kind of silly. Suspension is also a temporary measure. All the cards we're suspending here will be removed from the suspension list by or before, okay, so that confirms my theory, the ranked Historic queue returning in March. Some may be returned to the playable pool, likely because we believe the new environment provides an appropriate answer or countermeasure, and the rest will be moved to a full banning. How will suspension be used? We are actively monitoring the cards and deck stats in Historic and regularly evaluating whether we feel like there are issues that need addressing. For this first Historic period, we're tending to keep a light touch, reacting less and seeing how things develop naturally. But in the future, we're likely to move cards on and off the suspension list more frequently. In a format like Historic, it's always our preference to provide answers to a problematic card rather than ban it, and that's one of the roles that future Historic Anthology will be serving. In some cases, a combination of new answers and an evolving meta will let us remove cards from the suspension list, but we feel like that's not going to happen, or at least won't happen for a while. We'll move the cards to the fully banned list. When cards are fully banned in Historic, you'll receive wild oh god, okay. I should probably read ahead before I start blabbering. When cards are fully banned in Historic, you will receive wildcard reimbursement as normal, with the caveat that you won't receive multiple reimbursements for the same individual card. For example, players collected 2 copies of card X when it is banned in Standard. They receive 2 wildcards at that time. Later, that card is also banned in Historic. They still only have 2 copies. They won't receive additional wildcards because they've already been reimbursed for the copies they have. However, if they've crafted or otherwise collected more copies between the Standard ban and Historic ban, they would receive reimbursement for those copies after the Historic ban. I think this is the perfect way to do it. You are not punishing Historic players for, Standard being a format. You're not punishing Standard players for Historic being a format. This allows you to basically say, hey, it'll actually it's probably really good for Standard players. Hey, remember that, you spent 4 Mythic Rare wildcards on Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, and now he's an issue in Historic? Well, now you can invest those wildcards into Standard, because it never says you have to be using these cards in Historic. It's just if you own these cards. So I think that's very powerful. In like a gameplay sense, not in a gameplay sense, in like a powerful in terms of allowing wizards to be it's very powerful to be able to move your wild cards. Powerful is probably not the right word. It's very cool that that's how they're doing that. They're not trying to be super greedy about it. We feel like Historic is in a healthy place and developing well, and these suspensions should help it continue to grow and diverse in interesting directions. To help along that, we have several upcoming Historic events and more on the horizon. We'll be completing our first Oh, the regular Historic constructed events. Okay, whoa. The regular Historic constructed events will begin on January 16th as Theros Beyond Death releases and Ranked Historic moves to the offseason while we focus on Standard. Then in March, we plan to release Historic Anthology 2 and the Ranked Historic will return. So, basically, they'll remove the Ranked queue. So you won't be able to play the Ranked queue, but you'll still be able to play Best of 3 normal, it sounds like. When Theros Beyond Death. So basically what their goal is here. Okay, ready? Standard set is released. Halfway between, so Theros Beyond Death is released. Then halfway between Theros Beyond Death and Ikoria, Historic Anthology is released. So basically, for half that time, you're in Standard, Theros is the game. Then Historic Anthology 2 is the game, and then Ikoria is released, and then for half that time, it's Ikoria, and then it's Historic Anthology 3, and then it's Core Set, and then it's so basically it's dividing the year into 8 instead of 4 seasons, where those seasons it goes Standard, Historic, and I think that's really good that they're embracing Historic as a real format here. We've got a lot more planned for Historic later in the year. This year's ending, but I assume they mean later in 2020, and we're actively working with a tabletop studio to design the remastered set we were talking about last update. I'm actually doing a video covering that coming out really soon. To answer one question we see a lot about these sets, they are being designed to support both constructed and limited play, but we'll talk about that as we get a bit closer. Until then, thank you for being part of Historic's debut. So basically, they said last time we're doing a remastered set, so imagine, Amonkhet and Our Devastation, right? We could combine those 2 sets together, get rid of some of the jank commons that don't mean anything, although since they are making this limited playable, they'll have to leave some jank commons, quote unquote. Remove Scarab God because that was way too overpowered, and basically pick and make, get rid of the worst parts of sets now that they've already been released and put them into MTG Arena. This allows them to have to develop less cards and allows us to get to parity, or at least close parity, with Pioneer, because I'll talk about this more in a future video, but if you're removing even this one common here, you're different than Standard Pioneer, and therefore I don't think we're ever going to get to that point, because they're purposely avoiding printing some of these cards. So I think it'll more be remastered, original Ravnica forward or Return to Ravnica forward, instead of just, this is Pioneer. Either way, that has been it for this video. I hope you guys have enjoyed. If you guys did and learned something new, please hit that like button and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!